I think you know why I stopped you. You ran the red light.
What actually happened was I was stuck in the middle of the intersection.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Probably the very first time we got to see and hear Kohberger, that's besides his first appearance in court in Pennsylvania, was when the original body cam was released of the 28-year-old during those two stops on December 15th. It was on the morning of the 15th. So there he is, he's in a white Elantra on eastbound Interstate 70, talking to Sergeant Nick Ernstes with the Hancock County Sheriff's Office at about 10:40, 22:11 in the morning. 10 minutes later, Indiana State Police Trooper Christopher Waltz pulls him over as well. The Kohberger we encounter here on December 15th, just over a month since the murders, is almost mute when speaking to both officers. And I'll put a link to both the first and the second stops in the description. You can watch them all in full on your own time. In fact, the entire interaction between both cops just 1 month after the murders lasts less than 5 minutes, or about 2 minutes 20 seconds each. Meanwhile, the stop by a female officer 1 month prior to the murders leads to an almost 10-minute interaction where Kohberger actively asks the female officer to explain the law to him. Quite a difference, right? Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do. I'll be following up this analysis with just some more information about Kohberger, but then also his defense. Does he really have a defense? If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and you can also hit the thanks button. And let's get started. Now, you may recall we spoke about context not long ago, just a few episodes ago, in fact, and this is another prime example of context. But what we're doing is we're seeing the context actually out of context and specifically out of order. The correct way to deal with this, and this is just a cursory way of doing that. I mean, I'm not going to analyze all three stops here, but the way you want to look at context, the correct way to look at context is chronologically. And as an author, I can tell you that is the right way to do it. You don't deal with context in the rearview mirror in the order that you find it. You need to deal with context chronologically. And that's also something you need to do and think about in your own life. If you're thinking about your own decision making, if you're thinking about the sort of occurrence, how can I put it, the way that certain things played out in your own life, you shouldn't think about it reverse chronologically. That's the wrong context, because you've got all the information with you at hand. You need to think about it within the information starvation phase that it played out, where when something happened, well, you didn't have a certain amount of information. Maybe somebody else didn't either. Does that make sense? And so what you really want to do in true crime is reimagine and recontextualize, but within the timeline, within the original rolling out of the timeline. So in other words, the context is only really contextually authentic when it's chronological. Now on Patreon, a patron, Gwen, highlighted the irony of the drastic difference between the two stops, and that's really the object of this exercise, is that you see one Kohberger in the first stop 1 month prior to the murders, and then you see seemingly a totally different Kohberger during the second and third stops. And so this is what she wrote. She wrote, quote, "Isn't it interesting the drastic difference in Kohberger's demeanor toward the officers?" That's obviously the male officers versus the female officer, as compared to his demeanor toward the officer when he was stopped for blocking an intersection. The blocking and intersection stop was prior to the killings, and the tailgating stops were after the killings. And so Gwen refers to him as Mr. Talkative. I have questions about the laws in this state. Seems to have been replaced by Mr. Reserved, quiet, cooperative, and agreeable. And I think another really interesting question is, so on the one hand you could say, well, it's the difference here is before and after the murders. But I think another really interesting question is, what if Kohberger had been stopped after the murders by a female officer? Would he also have had questions? And I think the answer may well be yes, because we got the sense that he was particularly argumentative and difficult with female students, and that the problems he seemed to have were with females. This is in bars, in a student setting, and now also in this setting. So very much so, right? You see that. We see that there are two Kohbergers, and to be clear, two very different Kohbergers. Which one is real? Well, I would suggest that both are real, that Kohberger can be argumentative and he can be quiet. He can sort of respect authority. He can do as he's told. He can know his place. It seems that he has the sort of personality that can seamlessly move between two poles in the spectrum, from quiet to argumentative, from argumentative to quiet. That also happens to be the same kind of personality that a drug addict has. Someone who can be quiet and amenable, and then someone who can be not that. And they can move seamlessly between the two. And doesn't this also show that he has two distinct aspects to his personality? And so I guess the real question is, which of the two is more the real Kohberger? So both are him. It's not one or the other, but one is more authentically him than the other. So which is the one that is trying to get out? Another way of putting it is, if Kohberger were under the influence, say, of alcohol, and is losing his inhibitions, or he's lost his inhibitions, would he become reserved, quiet, and cooperative, or difficult, demanding, and argumentative? Which one do you think it is? And my sense is that Kohberger has a very large chip on his shoulder, particularly regarding the opposite sex. And like Brian Laundrie, is not naturally good at making or keeping friends. But he does seem to have a slightly better relationship with men than he does with women. I think he feels insecure, weak, emasculated, inadequate when he's in the company of women in a way that he doesn't around men. So just another final point regarding the stops. It's very unusual to be driving long distance across America. I did that. I went across the length and breadth of America. Sometimes I drove all day for a number of days. And even when you do that, you don't get terribly far. You don't make a lot of headway. Even though I had a lot more time to play with than he did, I still made several flights to ultimately cover the distance I needed to cover. And you may recall that when he was stopped, one of the officers said, "Wow, you come all the way from Idaho, all the way from Pullman. Don't you guys believe in air travel?" And that joke, never a truer word spoken in jest, was actually quite true. I mean, road tripping 2,500 miles from Pullman to Pennsylvania isn't only fairly unusual, it's also the way drug traffickers would get around. And why is that? Why would you go by vehicle and not some other way? Well, catching flights is a security risk. You hand over your identity. You provide a record of not only yourself and where you are, but also where you're going and when you're going. And just as it was a security risk for Brian at that time, if he had flown out of the airport, the local airport, on the 15th, would his name have been flagged? Would the officers have, checked those flights? And I think they would have. So catching flights is a security risk. And just as it very much was for Caitlin Armstrong. So the cops in Indiana doing a drug interception were totally spot on to apprehend a vehicle that had come from so far away. Another interesting irony is, had he not changed the plates, that's Kohberger, had he not changed the plates from Pennsylvania to Washington on November 18th, he may not have been stopped in Indiana, because Indiana is quite close to Pennsylvania. But then he may well have been stopped closer to Washington and Idaho with Pennsylvania plates, and possibly for the same reason. Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.